On a day associated with a battlefield truce between the soldiers of both sides, how is it possible that more than 100 men died on the battlefields of France and Flanders, and others much further afield at sea? What's the story of those men who died on Christmas Day 1914? With the Christmas holidays approaching, it's that time of year when we think of family and friends. And it was good this week to have another podcast supporters evening where we got together and we heard a great talk by Rick Smith from the Hawthorne Ridge Crater Association to tell us about the work that they do, with also input from Terry Berry and also Dane Wright, one of the archaeologists who's looked at the site. We have one of these evenings about once a month, and it's for those of you who are so kind to support the website via Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. And if you've ever donated through either of those platforms, then you'll receive information about these evenings via those websites and often via email as well. And it's good that we're building this kind of Great War community through the podcast, because we all have that mutual interest in the First World War in common and a desire to see the battlefields accessible, understandable, and we have interests in the preservation of battlefield sites like the Hawthorne Crater on the Somme. And the association there has done some incredible work in making that an accessible site, a site that is much more easy to understand with less trees in it, and also preserving it, actively preserving it for future generations. And sometime next year when we can travel again, we seem to say that quite a lot recently, but I'm aiming to go to the crater and talk to the team there on site to discover more about the kind of work that they do and why it's such an important location. But the community aspect of this podcast is one that initially I hadn't really planned or even thought about, but it's a nice development of what we've done here. And with that in mind, here's a little Christmas challenge to you. I can look through my website and my podcast hosting statistics to find out which countries people listen to the podcast or visit the website from, but that only gives me kind of one-dimensional view of that. And what it'd be really interesting to see visually is where you listen to the podcast. Now, I know many of you listen to it in all sorts of different locations. Sometimes in your room where you've got your Great War books, sometimes out on a run or walking the dog. Some of you have gone over to the battlefields in the months recently when we've been able to do that and listened to the podcast actually at the sites that are mentioned in that particular episode. But wherever it is you listen to the podcast most of all, tweet me about it. Tweet me to Somcorps or at the Old Front Line and send me a photograph of where it is. You walk your dog and listen to the podcast, or go for your run, or walk in the local park, or whatever it is. Let's find out where we listen, what countries we listen from. Tell me that too, because that would be really interesting to know about the international audience for the podcast that I know we have. And I think it's a great way of understanding kind of where we all come from and where our vision of the Great War is, to a certain degree, defined by. And it's also nice to see that multinational aspect of podcast listening in the social evenings that we've had, with just this week Gil from Belgium and Ian from Canada being amongst those who attended this week's event. So you've got plenty of things to do, I know, over the Christmas period, but if you find yourself with a spare moment and you want to tweet me a photograph of where it is you listen to the podcast, let's do that. And as we move towards a new year, this will be the final podcast of 2021. It should have gone out on Christmas Day, but I thought I'll release it on Christmas Eve for you, so you've got something to listen to while you're wrapping your final presents. But please do have a great holiday. Enjoy your time with family and friends or whoever you are with. Thanks for all your support, whether it's just listening to the podcast, and that is a really important aspect of supporting what we do here, or whether it's through making comments about the podcast on the podcast website, or putting a review onto Apple Podcasts, or supporting us via Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, and the many, many emails that I get. I really, really do appreciate those. You've helped developed the podcast this year. You've helped make the podcast what it is, and I can't thank you enough, all of you, for your support. This will be the final episode, as I say, of 2021. There'll be a couple of weeks off, and then we'll be back again for the continuation of this podcast season in January 2022. And we've got lots of exciting subjects ahead. We've got a few guests that are going to come on to the podcast, and I hope that sometime in the late winter and the early spring, I'll be back out on those battlefields and make some more recordings and do some more research for future podcast stories. But for now, it's a Christmas tale of the Great War, something a little bit different this time. We've looked at the story of the Christmas Truce before, but what about parts of the line where it wasn't so quiet? So let's discover more about the men who died on Christmas Day 1914. As 1914 came to a conclusion, where was the British Army on the Western Front? The British Army, or more correctly the British Expeditionary Force, had gone to war in August of 1914. Britain had declared war on the 4th of August, and the very first troops arrived in France the very next day, on the 5th of August. It fought its first battle at Mons on the 23rd, and then was in the retreat from Mons via Le Cateau down to the Marne and the Aisne. And then in the autumn of 1914, the fighting had taken the British Army alongside its French and its Belgian allies up into northern France and across the border into Belgium, into Flanders, for the first Battle of Ypres and the fighting around La Bassée, where the Germans were stopped in the so-called Race to the Sea. This led to both sides digging in, and during that winter period of 1914 on into 1915, the establishment of the trench system that would become the Western Front over the course of the next 4 years. And I think if you take a casual look at the end of the 1914 campaign, it's easy to think that with the closing down of the first Battle of Ypres in November and the fighting involving British troops around Armentières and La Bassée in northern France, it's easy to think that that kind of just ended and then it was all quiet. That wasn't really the reality of what happened, and even when the first trench systems were dug, the British reaction was to take them head on, to attack them. And although we perhaps think that the first British offensive of the Great War is Neuve-Chapelle in March of 1915, in fact British troops attacked German positions in small-scale attacks, small-scale offensives almost, in December of 1914. For example, on the 14th of December, British troops attacked the ground around Petit Bois, near to the village of Wytschaete, what became known to the British Tommy as White Sheet. There was that famous incident when men of the Gordon Highlanders went into action there and were cut down by German machine gun fire. And very sadly, their bodies lay out in no man's land for much of the next 3 years. There are many memoirs of the Great War of men who were there in 1915 and 1916 who mention these bodies being visible out in no man's land on the battlefield. The journal of Private Fraser, a Canadian soldier, a Scottish-born Canadian soldier, who was there with the 31st Alberta Battalion. Being a Scotsman, he recognised the Gordon kilt and got a permission from one of his officers to go out into no man's land at night and collect some of the identity discs from the dead and bring them in to prove that these men had been killed, so that the families back home, waiting in agony with the news of a missing soldier, could finally have that death confirmed and to have what we'd now perhaps call closure. But he went out there and he recovered some identity discs and pay books, but he also found that the letter, I remember, of one of the men that he read back in the trench when he returned, that was written the night before the attack to his wife, saying that they were about to make this big attack on the German lines and hopefully end the war by Christmas. Sadly, that wasn't to be the case. But that attack wasn't the only one. A few days later, on the 18th of December, there was fighting around Neuve-Chapelle and Rouge Banks in northern France. On the 19th of December, at Givenchy, around the La Bassée Canal sector, which was the kind of southern end of the British front at that particular point. And then again in Flanders on the same day, this time at Plug Streets, just outside Plug Street Wood, at a German trench position called the Birdcage. And in particular, the 1st Battalion, the Somerset Light Infantry, were very heavily involved in that. And characters like Bertie Prowse, who had Prowse Point named after him close by that action, which would eventually become Prowse Point Cemetery. He would go on to command the 1st Somersets and then the brigade they were in and be killed on the first day of the Somme. Valentine Braithwaite, a young officer who was awarded the Military Cross for the fighting there in December 1914, he would go on to serve at Gallipoli the following year with his father and then also be killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. These are characters that I've mentioned in the podcast before and were very heavily involved in this fighting around the birdcage and in the sector south of Ypres in December of 1914. So what these small-scale attacks tell us, whether it's Petit Bois, Rouge Banks, Givenchy or the birdcage, is that the British Army was not static in any kind of way in December of 1914. It was harassing the enemy. But what that also meant, as the fighting did die down and Christmas approached, is that there were bodies in no man's land, the dead from those battles. And the desire to bury the dead was one of the things that would eventually lead to the Christmas Truce of 1914. This is a bit of a forgotten period of the fighting on the Western Front, and there's a very good book by Chris Baker, which I'll put a link to on the podcast website, and I would thoroughly recommend that book to get an insight into this period leading up to the Christmas Truce and these small-scale actions. And there's also a link on his website, on the Long Long Trail, the definitive Great War website in many ways, where there's a summary of some of these actions too, and I'll put a link to that on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, for you to have a look at. But that key point about the dead is really, I think, a key to understanding what in many sectors led to the truce taking place. There's a lot of modern views of what the truce is, inspired partly by cinema, Joyeux Noël, the famous film where we see British, German and French troops all in the same field somehow. A female opera singer suddenly smuggled into the trenches by the Germans, then giving a recital in no man's land. I mean, this is the kind of fanciful idea of what the truce was like. The reality, and I interviewed quite a few veterans who'd taken part in the truce. One of them was a regular soldier, the others were territorials in the London regiment. Their view was that this was a way of having a day off without the higher-ups, and that's a phrase that they often used to use about whether that was senior officers or politicians, but the higher-ups not really getting to know about it. I mean, eventually they did, and there was talk of court-martials and punishment and so on, but that never happened. But the point I'm making is that while we look upon the truce today, 100 and something years later, as some moment of peace in no man's land, and it was literally peace because there was no fighting in some sectors, it was not this moment necessarily of great humanity. There were practical reasons to bury fallen comrades who died in the recent fighting, and there was this idea that you'd have a day off from your duties as a soldier, and that for men who were in regular units or even territorial units, particularly in the conditions of those primitive trenches of 1914, was something that I'm sure they would have welcomed. But it was not a universal truce. Not every British unit participated, and not every German unit participated. And in that Christmas period of 1914, the British line extended from south of Ypres near to the village of Saint-Éloi. We weren't in occupation of the city of Ypres at that time. That was a French sector of the battlefields, with the Belgians just further to the north. So we were from the village of Saint-Éloi southwards, facing the Messines Ridge that had been captured by the Germans in the battles of 1914. We extended down through those villages, across and around the big wood expanse of Plugstert, where Plug Street Wood was located, down into the ground around Armentières at places like Houplines, and then across to villages like Bois-Grenier, Fleur Bay, and down towards Neuve-Chapelle, and then round via Festubert and Givenchy down to the La Bassée Canal. And the La Bassée Canal roughly marked the delineation between the British and the French lines in northern France, although on the other side of the canal, the village of Quinchy, there were British troops holding some of the positions there. But that was roughly our front, Saint-Éloi down to the La Bassée Canal via the high ground, facing the high ground of the Messines Ridge, and then down through the flatlands around Armentières and northern France towards that canal system near to the town of Bethune. And the main towns behind our lines at that moment was not Popperinga. Popperinga was then also part of the French sector. It was Balliol in northern France and Bethune. They were the two key reception areas, and a lot of units that were not in the line on Christmas Day 1914, that's where they were. And you've got to remember as well that many of these units that were in the line on Christmas Day 1914 had taken part in some of the fighting, and whether they would have had the stomach to go forward and shake a German's hand is debatable given those circumstances. But what this meant was that not everybody took part in the truce. There were truces. We won't mention football, but there were truces at places like Plug Street and near to Messines and down near Armentières and lots of other places. But there were parts of the line where there was no truce at all and the war carried on. And what this meant, which I think is of great surprise to many people, is that soldiers died on Christmas Day 1914. The whole war, did not stop. And what we're going to do in this podcast is look at those deaths on that iconic day of the 25th of December 1914 and discover more about them. And we'll do that starting with the data from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database of those men. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission website is there essentially for people looking to trace their relatives who died in the two world wars. You can go on and you can import a name and you can find out where they're buried or commemorated. But for historians, it's got a wider use because you can essentially interrogate that database to find out information. And we've done that a few times on the podcast when we did, for example, an episode on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres to look how much of a deadly day that was in Flanders during the Great War. And with this subject, looking at Christmas Day 1914, we can do the same because you can go on to their search page, not put any names in, but you can put a specific date, you can put an area where men are commemorated, or you can even put a specific memorial as part of the search criteria. What I did for this was just to put in the 25th of December 1914 and have all of the worldwide commemorations for that date come through. Now, the reason I did that is because, as we'll discover, the war staying quiet, staying static, the idea of no fighting taking place was not just limited to the Western Front. And we'll see that an essential part of the wider world war that this conflict had become, the war at sea, also features in this story, and we'll look at some aspects of that. So, having put that date into the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, it comes back with a list of names. What you can then do is download that list into an Excel spreadsheet file, and once you've got that up on your Mac or your PC, you can then put that in unit order or location order or commemoration order, and you can draw all sorts of information from that. So what do we get when we do this? Well, the list that's produced has 148 names on it. So that's 148 names of service personnel killed worldwide on Christmas Day 1914. When we examine where they died from that list, we see that 21 of them died in Belgium, 57 in France, 31 are on the Tower Hill Memorial, and 6 on naval memorials. So that's about a quarter of the names on naval personnel who were buried at sea. And as I say, more of that shortly. But obviously initially looking at the Western Front and how quiet or not quiet that was on Christmas Day 1914, what do these numbers tell us? Of those who died in France and Flanders, and this is one of the keys to understanding as to whether these men died of their wounds, died of sickness caused by active service, or were killed in action, which is what we want to discover to find out if men were actually killed in action on Christmas Day. What we discover of the 21 men who died in Belgium and the 57 in France is that 18 are on the La Tourette Memorial to the missing, 8 are commemorated on the Plugstert Memorial, and 6 are on the Meningate Memorial in Ypres. Now that means all of those men have no known grave. And to have no known grave, it's much more likely that they've been killed in action. That either they died on the battlefield and their bodies were unrecoverable, And so eventually, with no marked grave, they would be commemorated on one of these memorials to the missing. Or it could be men, as was not uncommon with the 1914 campaign of men killed on the battlefield. They would be buried close by, and later fighting would destroy their graves, and there was no trace of them after the war. But if we use this as an immediate kind of indicator of criteria for men killed, it means that almost half of those names of men who died in Belgium or France are killed in action on the battlefields. So not an insignificant number. When we break it down by unit, and you can search through the data and you can put it into unit order, and that gives you a bit of an indication then as to who might be involved in this. We see 8 men from the Coldstream Guards, 6 from the Grenadier Guards. Now, that immediately, that both of those units had battalions that were together in the same Guards Brigade on the southern end of the British sector, close to the La Bassée Canal, just north of it, in fact. So that immediately leads us in the direction of the war diaries of those units to find out a little bit more. And then when we look at the ones that were lost at sea, we discover that the 31 who are commemorated on the Tower Hill Memorial, they're part of the Merchant Navy. There are 8 men from the Royal Naval Reserve and 5 men from the Royal Navy. And that ties us into the sort of men that were serving at sea and died at sea on Christmas Day 1914. So that's our raw data, and the next step is to delve deeper into the records. We've got a list of names, we've got a list of units, and we can now look to the war diaries, and you can find these on sites like Ancestry, where they've photographed a large number. The most complete collection is on the UK National Archives website, where at the moment, if you register and set up an account, you can download PDF copies of war diaries for free, which is a really good resource, and you can keep them on your hard drive once you've downloaded and build up quite a little archive of war diaries to use in your research. And the early diaries that exist are often pencil written, sometimes on squared notepaper rather than the actual war diary sheets that the War Office had produced before the war, but which there were not enough to be dispatched to all the different units on the Western Front in 1914 and early 1915. Being written in pencil, often quite difficult to read, sometimes sparse in detail. It really depended on the adjutant, who's one of the officers of the battalion. It was his job to write the war diary up. But these diaries give quite an insight into it. And a couple of the veterans that I interviewed over the years were, one of them was an adjutant, the other one was the battery adjutant for his siege gun battery. And I looked at the war diaries that they wrote and spoke to them about this. And they said that often they were under pressure when they were writing these diaries. There was so much going on with surviving the war, with dealing with your men, and then the kind of administration of the unit, that writing up the diary was not always of high priority. So Malcolm Vivian, who was the gunner officer, all he wrote in there was what targets they were firing at, what the weather was like, what the air pressure was, and that kind of information, the weather and the air pressure, was all key to the use of their artillery and the way they set the fuses and calibrated the guns. So he felt that was the most important information to put in there. For future historians, it didn't really give enough of the amount of detail you'd need to reconstruct the story of what it was they were doing. But I think there can be few soldiers who have one eye on a century ahead in the future to future historians and what they'd make of what these men were doing on the ground. Anyway, so that's where we're going to turn to next, the records, to find out more about these 148 names, or the stories of some of those men who died on Christmas Day 1914. Now, given that the Guards regiments were so prominent in those listings, let's start with the Guards as an example of what might have happened on Christmas Day in the less quiet sectors of the British part of the Western Front. When we look at that list of names, the first Guards unit that jumps off the page is the 2nd Battalion, the Coldstream Guards. They were part of the 4th Guards Brigade that pre-war had brought together men from different Guards battalions, different Guards regiments into one infantry brigade, and itself was part of the 2nd Division, the higher formation that it was attached to. And it was mobilised for war in August 1914 and went off immediately and served right through those battles of the 1914 campaign, from the retreat from Mons down to the Marne and the Aisne, and the First Battle of Ypres and the stabilisation of the front. It had spent, after all of its fighting that it had taken part in during the late summer on into the autumn of 1914, it had spent the first 21 days of December in rest at a village called Metteren behind the lines, not far from Bethune, a village that would eventually be caught up in the battles of April 1918, but then was a quiet little village, still with the bulk of its civilian population, and where these men were billeted. At that stage of the war, there were no proper camps behind the lines, so the men were either billeted in tents in fields or more commonly in agricultural buildings. A billeting officer would go out, find some big barns, work out how many men could get into each barn, and then he'd write on the outside, often in chalk, how many men could go in there, and then the unit would turn up and they'd dispatch the men off into these different locations. Fairly primitive living conditions, no kind of comfy mattress or a sergeant major to read you a story to send you to sleep. It was what the soldiers call a palliasse of straw, which is straw on the ground. You sleep on that, you're in close confines with other soldiers, and that's when soldiers begin to realise that they're going to get covered in body lice, because lice breed in the conditions of these agricultural buildings, often from farm animals that would have been there, transport themselves onto the bodies of soldiers, and they spread like wildfire in the sweaty armpits and elsewhere of the soldiers who are out of the line. So it's very uncomfortable eventually for some of these men because they're scratching, and that's when it leads to soldiers getting rid of these lice that frequently breed in the seams of their uniforms. They get a candle out, light that candle and run it up the seam of their tunic or their trousers, and it makes this popping noise as the lice eggs pop. That was called chatting by the soldiers. It was something that no doubt was done in other campaigns of the British Army before the war, and it was a time where you sat there, did this, and you chatted away to your mates. That's how the term came into use. After 3 weeks in the village of Metteren, they went up to nearer to the front, to the town of Bethune, and they were billeted in the girls' school there. This was a building that the British Army took over fairly early on in the Great War and is mentioned in quite a few memoirs. Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die and Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, for example. And they used a building like this girls' school because it was a large building, could accommodate a large number of soldiers, and it was pretty solid. And within the urban confines of a town like Bethune, there was not the sort of agricultural buildings that men would normally be put up in. So schools, factories, breweries were all used by the army to accommodate men in these early years of the war in places like this. From here they then marched up towards the front line near Le Touret. Le Touret was a hamlet just behind the front line in the trenches close to the Rue de Bois at Richebourg, and it was there that they went into the line on Christmas Eve, on 24th December 1914, and the men of the battalion were working on the trenches. It says in the war diary that the Germans threw a few bombs and snipers caused a few casualties that day. And bombs, this is grenades, the war had gone static, and this type of weapon, which in the mobile war that everyone thought they were going to fight in 1914, wasn't really an appropriate weapon to be using. But when you're dug in trenches close to an enemy, then hand grenades. And at this stage of the war, the Germans were likely to be lobbing Kugelgranaten at the British. These were sphere grenades, not the German stick grenades, with a couple of different versions of it. One that was like a big pineapple, which would break up into fragments, and one that was more of a smooth round bomb with a band round it, with a friction igniter with a 5.5 second fuse on it, and these would be thrown by the Germans with largely kind of black powder explosive on the inside, and there'd be a mighty flash and a big bang, and these were, in some respects, in the close confines of trench warfare, probably a bit more lethal than the stick grenades, the potato mashers, as we often call them. So as Christmas Day dawned, their war diary recorded that it was very cold and freezing hard. Reading some of these diaries for this period, you can get a real sense of the weather, and it makes you feel cold just by reading about it. And it was quite a hard winter. It wasn't the hardest of the war, but obviously living outside in ditches in the middle of open fields in northern France was a world away for the experience of even the most hardened regular soldier in these units, because they'd lived in barracks in Britain, or perhaps in barracks in India or in other parts of the empire at that time. And although they were a tough generation, living outside like that in sub-zero conditions was not an easy prospect, and men did suffer as a consequence of it. They record in their diary for that day no mention of any kind of truce, no mention of any sign of the Germans coming out into no man's land. What they say is that snipers caused a few casualties, otherwise quiet. And their idea of quiet was to have 7 men killed in action, several of whom are commemorated on the Le Tourret Memorial or buried in Le Tourret Military Cemetery, as one in Guard Cemetery at Windy Corner. So a quiet time for them was not going out into no man's land to have a truce with the enemy. It was a normal day on the Western Front, with men killed through snipers, grenades, and the day-to-day activity of trench warfare. So there was no sign of a truce from the Germans here. In most cases, the truce on the British sector of the Western Front was instigated by German soldiers. And in many cases, those German soldiers, particularly in Flanders, were Saxon troops. Here they were Westphalians. So whether the Westphalians had a different view of Christmas or a view of what the enemy meant to them at that time, we can only but speculate. But some Westphalians did take part in a Christmas truce a little bit further north with Indian troops a bit nearer to Neuve-Chapelle. So there's obviously some desire within those troops of the German army to take part in a truce, but here, possibly because of the nature of the fighting that had been going on, there was no truce here. And indeed, from this position, south of the Rue du Bois at Richebourg, down towards the La Bassée Canal, there's no evidence of any truces in that sector of the British line. A neighbouring Guards battalion who were also in the trenches on Christmas Day was the 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards. They had 6 men killed in action on the 25th of December 1914. They too were part of that 4th Guards Brigade, and they'd also been out on rests in villages near to the town of Bethune. On the 23rd of December, they marched via the village of Essères up towards that area around Le Tourret, just behind the lines, and then into the trenches at a position known as the Rue de Cailloux, and relieved the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment. The war diary notes, trenches, mainly improvised from dykes, were full of water. The mud was very bad, and several men had to be dug out of the mud. And again, this gives us a bit of an insight into the quite primitive and difficult conditions that British soldiers were living in on Christmas Day. And you can see, if this was true right across the British front, which most likely it was, then in areas where there was a truce, that was again another impetus to come up out of your trenches if they were nothing more than flooded ditches full of liquid mud. Not a very nice place to be. And if you come out up onto even frozen ground, at least you were getting a bit of a relief from that. Here in this sector at the Rue de Cailloux, there was no evidence of any quietude on the part of the Germans. On Christmas Eve, the war diary records that the Germans had sapped to within 10 yards of our front line, and they later blew in part of the trenches. Now, this is some early evidence of mining warfare. They weren't digging the kind of subterranean galleries that were made later on, but they were digging saps or small tunnels towards enemy positions. Both sides were doing this and laying charges of explosive. The French had done it, the Germans were doing it, and there's some evidence that the British were doing it, but they lacked the same kind of explosives at this stage to be able to do it. And it wasn't lifting explosive that they were using at this time, as the tunnellers used later on to lift huge volumes of soil and chalk and mud and everything else. It was blasting explosives. They were trying to blow positions in. And that night, instead of looking out across no man's land and watching Christmas trees and Christmas lanterns and listening to carols from the other side of the battlefield, instead these men were up to their usual work, and they were trying to dig a new trench in their positions here facing the Germans, but shell fire came down on them while they were doing it, resulting in 4 officer casualties and 53 men killed, wounded or missing. On Christmas Day they did get a bit of a light show. Star shells lit up the entire landscape early in the morning, and these were shells that were sent up to illuminate the battlefield to see if the enemy were up to anything. particularly when they knew that the enemy might be out there wiring, patrolling, or other kinds of activities. So these went up, lit up the battlefield, and then the War Diary, like many that day, that in areas where there was no truce, records there was a lot of sniping. Now, this didn't necessarily mean the Germans had whole regiments of snipers on these fronts. I think that these were probably just normal German riflemen, but the amount of rifle activity probably made some of these British soldiers believe that they were up against German snipers. And while there may well have been some, at this stage the Germans weren't really investing in that kind of sniper activity, true sniper activity, that they did later on, and indeed the British themselves did do. They spent the whole day in the trenches up to the point that it got dark, and they were relieved that evening at 7 p.m. The War Diary notes that 1 officer had been wounded, 3 men were killed, 19 wounded, and 2 were missing. So again, this is not untypical of the day-to-day casualties that battalions like this were suffering in trenches, and there was no hint of any kind of Christmas spirit here. It was just a normal day in the front line, work as usual. Now, the War Diary only gives us one view of what was happening. In many cases, we have no eyewitness accounts of some of these units, but we have an officer called Mar Jeffries, who was a major in this battalion, who gives us this account of what happened following the star shells lighting up the battlefield. He says, "At daybreak, a few Germans put their heads up and shouted Merry Christmas. Our men, after yesterday, were not feeling that way and shot at them. They at once replied, and a sniping match went on all day." So again, we can see from this is what accounted for these casualties. In this case, perhaps the Germans would have instigated a truce, but the British soldiers, having been tunnelled towards and blown up the day before and suffered a lot of casualties, particularly in that evening attempt to dig a new trench, they had no stomach for fraternising with the enemy. So it never happened, and the war here just rumbled on. So with these 2 examples of Guards battalions, we've got units that are not interested in taking part in a truce because of the fighting that's been going on right up to Christmas Day. In other areas where there were truces, the truce goes wrong and casualties are suffered as a consequence of this. Up in the Hoop Line sector was the 5th Battalion, the Scottish Rifles, the Cameronians. There's an account by Rifleman John Erskine of this battalion in Malcolm Brown and Shirley Seaton's book on the Christmas Truce, and it's one of those that I would highly recommend, and I'll put a link to it on the podcast website. So this is Erskine's account of what happened in their sector at Hoop Lines. "We had a tragedy in the trenches during the time of the handshaking, etc., which was going on. One of the regulars disobeyed our strict order not to fire and let off a shot. The Germans immediately replied, and instead of firing on where the shot came from, they evidently fired at the first person they saw. Unfortunately, this happened to be one of our corporals, who was shot through the head. The man who died was Corporal Walter Sinclair Smith, who actually officially died of his wounds the next day on the 26th of December. He was one of several brothers in the same battalion, and they were from Dunoon in Argyll, and their father was a major in the army. The Wargrave's entry for his burial at Cité Bongin Cemetery in Armentières records that he was in fact the eldest of 5 brothers who served. Further down the line, at the village of Bois Grenier to the south of Armentières, the 1st Battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment were in the line there. They had 3 men killed that day. 2 of them are listed on the Plugsturt Memorial to the Missing, so with no known grave, and 1 is buried at Balliol. Here they found themselves in a join between 2 types of German troops, Saxons on one side and Prussians on the other side, and while the Saxons took part in a truce, the Prussians didn't, and being in that join between one active enemy battalion that was opening fire and one that was not, resulted in these casualties. And this exposes one of the problems of the truce, is that if everyone is not in agreement and there's no clear rules of disengagement, as it were, then these kind of accidents where men get shot by Germans who are not aware that a truce is taking place and see what to them is enemy soldiers in no man's land and quite legitimately fire at them, this is the end result, several men getting killed. And what of Flanders, because that is the area we most associate with the Christmas Truce of 1914, with Bruce Bairnsfather in no man's land at Plug Streets, where he goes out in his goatskin jerkin, and then on the eastern side of Plug Street Wood The London Rifle Brigade are there. We've got very good witness accounts of that from people like Henry Williamson, the author. While all of that was indeed going on, it wasn't entirely universal. The 2nd Battalion of the Monmouthshire Regiment, for example, which was a Welsh territorial battalion formed before the war and was one of many territorial battalions sent to France in 1914, they were in the line near Plug Street, just to the other side, the southern side of the wood. They'd been out burying the dead, and as I mentioned, this was one of the main reasons that led to truces in different part of the British line, to go out and bury the dead from the recent fighting. And this was considered a safe thing to do because there'd been an agreement between British officers and German officers as to both sides would not open fire to allow this burial of the dead to take place. Because if you think about it, it was for the mutual benefit of both sides. No one wants to be living in a ditch in these kind of conditions with rotting corpses stinking the whole battlefield out and making life even more unpleasant. So a truce to bury the dead seems a logical thing to do given the circumstances. But here, obviously, the order had not entirely gone round to everyone, and 2 men were shot in the open returning from the burial of the dead. One of these was Sergeant Frank Collins of the 2nd Monmouths. He was a 39-year-old postman from Monmouth. He'd taken tobacco and jam to the Germans as gifts on Christmas Day, going out into no man's land, burying the dead. They'd encountered German soldiers, and out of curiosity both sides had spoken to each other. And Collins perhaps had looked at his enemy and had thought, they don't seem much different to us. Let's share something with them on this day of days. Let's take them some gifts. So he'd taken some tobacco, he'd taken some jam, probably some Tickler's plum and apple jam. Both of these things in 1914, when you read the accounts of soldiers, there's plenty of tobacco and there's plenty of jam. So this wasn't anything that was in shortage to them. So he took this across, gave it to the Germans, and on his way back across no man's land, having done his good deed for Christmas Day, a German somewhere who wasn't aware of the truce, wasn't aware of the burial of the dead, or perhaps for some other reason, opened fire and he was killed. He and the other soldier from the battalion who died that day are buried in the Calvary Essex Military Cemetery, just close to the Franco-Belgian border. And although quite a lot of units in Flanders did take part in the truce, just like the sector in northern France, there were parts of the line where the Germans or the British were not keen on doing it. The 2nd Battalion, the South Lancashire Regiment, that was part of the 3rd Division, which again had been at the front since the very beginning of the war and had been in reserve at Mons and in the retreat from Mons and the Marne and the Aisne and the First Battle of Ypres, they were in the line close to the village of Saint-Éloi. They'd marched up from Balliol, the town behind the lines, up to the Lindenhoek sector, which was a bit of trenches near to the village of Saint-Éloi, and this was part of the northernmost British position as of Christmas Day 1914. On their lefts to the north from them would have been French soldiers, for example, close to the village of Zillebeek. On Christmas Day, the War Diary records that it was still very cold and freezing hard. The situation was quiet, 3 men killed, 3 wounded. Given all the death and destruction that the men of that battalion must have seen in 1914, perhaps the death of 3 men and 3 comrades being wounded, even on Christmas Day, was not a notable event to them. In fact, the diary seems to be more concerned with the fact that sweets had been handed out to the men in the very front-line trenches, and there's no mention at all of the Germans, so no truce there. So if we look at that overview of the British front from Saint-Éloi to the Le Basset Canal, probably no more than 30-odd miles as the crow flies, we see a very varying picture. We see some German units, particularly Saxons, keen to take part and keen to instigate a truce, often resulting in an actual truce where both sides eventually come out into no man's land. We see some areas where even when there was a truce, no clear rules were drawn up and men got killed accidentally. We see areas where there was a join of 2 German units. One participated, one didn't want to participate, and men got killed that way. And we see quite a more general picture on many parts of the British line where either the British did not want to take part in it because of recent events, or the Germans did, or perhaps neither of them wanted to take part in any kind of truce. So the whole idea that everybody came up out of their trenches on Christmas Day, shook hands with the enemy, whatever that enemy was, and celebrated the Christmas spirit, celebrated the day that it was, really is quite untrue when we look at the men that were killed and we look at the sectors where pretty much fighting continued as on any normal day. And we've got to ask ourselves, over 100 years ago, did Christmas really mean as much to these men as it means to us now? It was a different world. And although there'd been a great influence of Germany through the royal family on British society and culture, and Christmas in that Dickensian Victorian period had come to mean something much more than it had been perhaps in many generations, given the circumstances of war, given the diet of propaganda, perhaps it's not surprising to find that not everybody had the stomach for a Christmas truce. But the war in 1914 was not just in the trenches of France and Flanders, it was at sea as well, and that's what we'll look at next. The war at sea in 1914 had seen some pretty big naval battles, but on Christmas Day that year, that's not what we see with the losses amongst men of the Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy. The records that we've got from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database show that there were 3 major losses at sea on the 25th of December 1914. And we're not seeing the war at sea and the war on land on the Western Front in any kind of isolation. They are connected. The naval operations in the North Sea and along the Channel coast were connected to activity on the northern part of the Western Front. The supply route to the battlefield came down through the North Sea and across the Channel. So the war at sea and the involvement of naval forces were just as connected to the operations on the Western Front, and they need to be understood in that context. The war at sea, the war in the air, and the war on the ground were all part of the same war, not separate wars. But what were these 3 losses at sea on this day in 1914? The first one involves SS Therese Hayman. There are 21 men on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database listed as serving with this vessel, including their master, Thomas Evans from Aberrath. The master of a merchant naval vessel was effectively the captain, the man in charge. And when we look at the crew, not all of them are from Great Britain, and this is not untypical when you look at merchant navy crews in both world wars. There's men from a variety of different nationalities. And here's one for Joka, one of our great podcast supporters, who's researching Swedes who served in the Great War, in particular those that fell on the Western Front. When I look at the crew list for this ship, I discover that First Engineer Johansson and another merchant seaman, Peterson, were both from Sweden. In the crew list as well, we see that there are men from Russia and Switzerland. So again, it gives us an insight into how diverse the merchant navy was in the Great War. The Therese Hayman, the ship, was built in 1890 as a coal cargo ship in Stockton-on-Tees. And after the bombardment of Scarborough, and this was the key naval event leading up to Christmas of 1914, when the Germans had come across and bombarded the Yorkshire coast and laid quite a big area of mines in the North Sea. The Germans had in fact created one of the densest minefields in that period of the history of the Great War. And the Therese Hayman was sunk by one of these mines just off Filey, with the loss of all hands. So the 21 men listed on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, all of them commemorated on the Tower Hill Memorial, where they'll have a little separate plaque for their ship with them all listed underneath. These were men killed by one of those mines that day. Not far away was another merchant ship, the SS Gem. This was a cargo ship built in 1887, which was en route from Mostyn to Tyne with over 460 tons of salt cake on board. It also found itself in this minefield that had been laid following the bombardment of the Yorkshire coast, and after striking one of these mines, the vessel broke in two and sank. So this was the same minefield that had taken out the other ship, took out the SS Gem. The master, J. McKeegan, was lost with 9 of his crew. So it wasn't a total loss for the men on board, but it was quite a substantial loss. There were very few survivors. And the third and final naval vessel that we'll look at that was lost on Christmas Day 1914, this was not a merchant vessel. This was a vessel of the Royal Navy. It was HM trawler Nighthawk, and serving in that were men from the Royal Navy and the Royal Naval Reserve. It was a 287-ton minesweeper, so presumably going out to try and clear up some of this dense minefield that had been laid by the Germans, but it got caught up in the density of that minefield, which was possibly a little too much for a single minesweeper, and it struck one of the mines just off Scarborough and blew apart. 6 of the 16 crew were killed. So if we look at these 3 examples, we aren't seeing the loss of any great battleship here on Christmas Day 1914. We're seeing 2 merchant vessels and 1 Royal Navy vessel, all of them caught up in the same minefield, all of them caught up in the same story, really, of the outcome of the bombardment of the British coast and the laying of this dense minefield in the North Sea. But when you go to a monument like Tower Hill in London and you see the thousands of merchant navy names on there, you see it gives you that incredible insight into the key role and the sacrifice made by merchant seamen in the Great War, and then again a generation later in the Second World War. And perhaps because of the Second World War, with the different convoys and the Arctic convoys, we tend to think of that being just the story of the merchant navy as about the Second War. But in the Great War, they performed a vital role of supply, with the movement of material from one part of Britain to another, across the Channel to the Western Front, and then to the wider theatres of war as well. And as I said at the beginning of this piece, this is not really something in isolation. The loss of these 3 relatively small vessels in the North Sea on Christmas Day, hundreds of miles from the events on the Western Front, is not a separate event. It's all part of the same war, and it's all connected, because one wouldn't be taking place without the other. And what I hope is that the loss of these naval vessels, the loss in the men in the trenches and on the battlefield of the Western Front on Christmas Day 1914, shows us that there is a different side to this idea of peace in no man's land, that it was this truce, it was an unquiet truce on some parts of the line. The fighting continued. Men were killed in action, whether that was facing the German army in France and Flanders, or at sea in a minefield laid by the Imperial German Navy. This was a total war now. The old world, the world of chivalry, was fading, and perhaps the Christmas Truce, to many, was the final moment of that old world, as the Western Front and the Great War moved into an even darker period where killing would take place on an industrial scale. And I hope that the next time we venture out to those battlefields and see some of the modern memorials to that truce in no man's land, we might pause and reflect that not everything was quiet, not everything was peaceful that day along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.